The air in the grand ballroom of the Astor Grand was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, dripped light onto a sea of polished marble, reflecting the gliding figures of New York's wealthiest citizens, men in bespoke tuxedos and women in gowns that shimmered like liquid jewels, moved with a practiced ease, their laughter sharp and brittle. It was a world of immense privilege, a carefully constructed stage where philanthropy was celebrated with champagne and whispered gossip. Along the periphery, nearly invisible against the gilded walls, the service staff moved like ghosts. They were the unseen gears of this opulent machine, their purpose to refill glasses and clear plates, ensuring the flawless illusion of effortless perfection for those who lived at the center of the universe. Presiding over it all was Eleanor Vance, the evening's host and the architect of this flawless world. At 42, she was the statuesque embodiment of power, her white couture gown a stark beacon of untouchable wealth. Her hair was pulled back into a severe chignon, not a single strand out of place, her expression a mask of bored control. Her cold, analytical eyes swept the room, not seeing people, but assets and liabilities. In a far corner, Samuel Reed moved with a quiet weariness that contrasted sharply with the room's electric energy. His janitor's uniform was worn but clean, a humble grey against a canvas of vibrant colour. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of labour, carefully collected empty glasses, his gaze fixed on the floor to avoid meeting the eyes of those he served. The collision of their two worlds was as swift as it was silent. A careless guest stepped back without looking, bumping Samuel's arm just as he reached for a flute of champagne. He stumbled, a small, almost imperceptible loss of balance, but it was enough. A single, perfect drop of red wine escaped a nearby glass and landed on the immaculate white silk of Eleanor's gown, blooming like a tiny crimson wound. The murmur of the crowd died instantly. A profound hush fell over the ballroom as hundreds of pairs of eyes followed the trajectory of that single drop. They landed on the stain, then on Eleanor's face, which had frozen into a mask of pure fury. Samuel stood paralyzed, the weight of every stare in the room pressing down on him, his apology lost in his throat. Eleanor let the silence stretch, savoring the collective tension. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with chilling precision. "Incompetent," she said, the word hanging in the air. "Completely invisible until you find a way to ruin something beautiful." She looked not at him, but at the stain, as if he were less than an insect. Then a cruel spark ignited in her eyes. She raised a perfectly manicured hand and pointed to the magnificent grand piano sitting on the stage. "You know what?" she announced to the rapt audience. "If a man like you can play a single decent note on that piano, I'll marry you." A wave of derisive laughter rippled through the crowd, a cruel chorus validating her power. It was a moment of such profound injustice, a casual tearing down of a man's soul. Sometimes, sharing these stories is the only way to fight back against that kind of darkness, and every time you subscribe, you help us keep that light on. Samuel stood frozen for a beat, the laughter of the crowd washing over him like a wave of acid. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot coil tightening in his stomach, but then he looked at the grand piano, its polished ebony surface reflecting the cruel, glittering lights of the ballroom. It was an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. With a dignity that defied his circumstances, he began to walk toward the stage. Each step was heavy, deliberate. The laughter quieted, replaced by a confused, expectant murmur. They were waiting for the final act of his degradation, the punchline to Eleanor's vicious joke. He didn't see them. He saw only the 88 keys, a silent language he had once spoken fluently, a world away from the mops and buckets that now defined his life. He sat on the plush leather bench, the feel of it foreign and luxurious. For a moment, he simply breathed, closing his eyes and letting the scent of old wood and polish fill his senses. A memory surfaced, so vivid it was almost painful. A small, sun-drenched room in a house he could no longer afford. His younger self seated at a worn, upright piano. His fingers, then nimble and unscarred by years of harsh cleaning chemicals, flew across the keys. His teacher, a kind old man with flour dust on his sleeves from the bakery downstairs, had called him a prodigy. He had promised him a future on stages just like this one, under lights just as bright. The memory was a ghost, a beautiful, haunting spectre of a life that had been stolen from him, not by malice, but by the slow, grinding erosion of tragedy and duty. His calloused fingers, so accustomed to the grip of a broom handle, found their old home on the ivory keys. He hesitated for only a second before the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor filled the cavernous hall. The sound was not the clumsy fumbling the audience anticipated. It was a note of pure, heartbreaking clarity, followed by another and another, weaving a melody thick with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. The music was a confession, a story of a soul that had been silenced but never broken. The whispers died completely. The clinking of glasses stopped. Every person in that ballroom, from the wealthiest tycoon to the most jaded socialite, was held captive by the sound of a janitor's forgotten dream. The opulent ballroom dissolved around him, replaced by the warm, gentle face of his wife as Sarah. He saw her as she was on their wedding day, her eyes sparkling as he played this very piece for her. He had promised her a life filled with music, a home where their children would fall asleep to the sound of the piano. The nocturne became a lament, each chord a memory of her laughter, of the scent of her hair, of the devastating day he lost her. The music flowed through him, a torrent of unshed tears for the woman who had been the symphony of his life. He wasn't playing for the crowd anymore. He was playing for her, a final, desperate love letter sent out into the void, hoping she could somehow hear him across the great divide. The melody then shifted, a current of anxiety and fear rippling through the melancholic grace. His daughter, Lily, materialized in his mind's eye. He saw her small, pale face against a stark white hospital pillow, her breathing labored, tethered to machines that beeped a rhythm far more terrifying than any metronome. The music became a prayer, a frantic bargain with a silent God. Each note was a plea for her health, a cry against the injustice of a world where a child's life depended on a stack of bills he could never hope to pay. The exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the endless nights spent in a cold hospital waiting room, the crushing weight of his powerlessness, it all poured out, transforming Chopin's masterpiece into a raw, desperate anthem of a father's love and fear. Eleanor stood motionless, her champagne flute forgotten in her hand. The music wasn't just sound, it was a force that dismantled her, piece by piece. It bypassed the high walls she had built around her heart and struck something deep within. A part of her she thought had died long ago. She no longer saw the clumsy janitor who had stained her dress. She saw a man of immense depth and soul, whose suffering was as real and profound as her own wealth was hollow. The crimson spot on her gown suddenly seemed like a mark of her own shame. Her cruelty, which had felt like a display of power just moments before, now felt like the pathetic tantrum of a spiritually bankrupt woman. Sometimes it takes a moment of pure, unvarnished truth to show us the fiction we're living. Telling these stories is how we find those truths together, and every subscription helps us continue that search. When the final, lingering note faded into the vast silence of the ballroom, Samuel's hands dropped from the keys. He didn't look up. He simply stared at his own hands, trembling slightly from the emotional torrent he had just unleashed. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a collective sense of shame and awe. No one dared to clap. It would have felt like a desecration. After a long moment, Samuel rose from the bench, turned his back on the stunned audience, and walked off the stage. He didn't look at Eleanor. He didn't look at anyone. He simply melted back into the shadows at the edge of the room, leaving behind a legacy in the air, a story told in 88 keys. By the next morning, the incident was an international sensation. Grainy cell phone footage of his performance was on every news site and social media feed, captioned "The Janitor's Symphony." The narrative was irresistible: the humble, hidden genius and the cruel, heartless billionaire. Eleanor was cast as the villain in a global drama, her name becoming a shorthand for arrogant privilege. Her board of directors convened an emergency meeting, demanding she issue a public apology, make a sizable donation to a musician's charity, and do whatever it took to contain the public relations disaster. But for the first time in her life, Eleanor wasn't thinking about her image. She was thinking about the music and the man who made it. Samuel found his quiet, anonymous life shattered. Reporters and television crews camped outside his modest apartment building in Queens, shouting questions and offering him money for his story. He felt like an animal in a zoo, his private grief suddenly public property. All he wanted was to be left alone, to get to the hospital, to sit by Lily's bedside without a camera lens following his every move. The sudden, unwanted fame was a suffocating blanket, isolating him more than his invisibility ever had. He would have given anything to go back to being the man no one noticed, the man who could move through the world without being seen, carrying his sorrow in peace. For days, Eleanor locked herself away in her sterile, minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park. She ignored the frantic calls from her lawyers and PR team, instead watching the video of Samuel playing over and over again. The mournful notes of the nocturne echoed through the vast, empty rooms, a stark contrast to the silence of her life. The music dredged up a memory she had long suppressed, a small girl with a violin, her own father snatching it from her hands, calling it a waste of time for the future CEO of his empire. In Samuel's pain, she recognized the echo of her own buried dreams, the artist she might have been. This path of self-discovery is often lonely and painful, a confrontation with the ghosts we've tried to outrun. We are so grateful you are on this journey with us, helping to illuminate these difficult human stories. The fragile bubble of their separate worlds was shattered by a single, devastating phone call. A doctor from the public hospital informed Samuel that Lily's condition had taken a critical turn. A rare complication meant she needed a highly specialized, experimental surgery. The procedure offered a glimmer of hope, but it came with a price tag that might as well have been $1 billion. The six-figure cost was a death sentence delivered in a calm, clinical tone. The humiliation in the ballroom, the media frenzy, it all evaporated. All that was left was the cold, terrifying reality that his talent, his soul, his very being was not enough to save his child. Through a private investigator she had hired in a desperate attempt to understand the man who had so thoroughly unraveled her, Eleanor learned of Lily's dire situation. The report lay on her marble coffee table, a cold, factual account of a life of quiet struggle, the death of a wife, the forgotten musical genius, the second job cleaning offices at night, and now, a daughter on the brink of death, held hostage by a medical bill. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of unbearable tragedy. Her public, drunken dare was no longer a cruel joke, but a grotesque irony. She held in her hands the power to change everything, to rewrite the ending of his tragic symphony. The realization was a terrifying weight, but also the first glimmer of purpose she had felt in years. She found him in the waiting room of the city's public hospital, a place so far removed from the gilded ballroom it felt like another planet. The air here was thick with the scent of antiseptic and quiet desperation. Harsh, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare on the scuffed linoleum floors and the rows of hard plastic chairs. Samuel was slumped in one of them, his frame looking smaller and more fragile than it had on the stage. His face, etched with an exhaustion that went bone-deep, was buried in his hands. He hadn't changed out of his work clothes from the night before. Eleanor stood at the entrance for a long moment, stripped of her couture, her makeup, and her armor. Dressed in simple slacks and a sweater, she was no longer a billionaire heiress. She was just a woman standing on the threshold of a pain far greater than her own. He didn't notice her at first. His world had shrunk to the rhythmic, terrifying beep of the machines down the hall and the crushing weight of the doctor's words. When he finally looked up, his eyes, clouded with grief, registered her presence with a slow, weary disbelief. There was no anger left in him, only a profound weariness. He straightened his back, a flicker of his quiet dignity returning, but his expression was a closed door. He clearly expected a new form of torment, a lawyer with a settlement or a reporter with a check. The chasm between them seemed wider than ever, defined not by wealth, but by the raw, undeniable reality of his suffering. She took a tentative step forward, the sound of her shoes on the floor unnaturally loud in the tense silence, feeling the full weight of her trespass into his sacred space of sorrow. Her voice, when she finally found it, was not the sharp, commanding instrument she was used to. It was a choked whisper, fragile and uncertain. "Mr. Reed," she began, then stopped, the formality sounding absurd. "Samuel," he simply stared, his silence a more potent judgment than any accusation. "I didn't come here to talk about that night," she said, her gaze falling to the floor. "I came to ask for your forgiveness. What I did was monstrous. I was empty and cruel, and I used you to feel powerful." A tear she hadn't anticipated slid down her cheek. "And then you played that music. It reminded me of something I buried a long time ago. A part of myself that once believed in beauty." She was confessing not just to him, but to the hollow ghost of the girl she used to be. "I know about your daughter," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of conviction. "I know about the surgery she needs." She looked at him directly then, her eyes pleading, stripped of all artifice. "I want to pay for it, for all of it. The surgery, the recovery, anything she needs." Samuel's weary expression hardened into one of deep suspicion. He had been a pawn in her world of careless power, and he saw no reason for that to change. His voice was raspy, raw with unshed tears and lack of sleep. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of disappointment. Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time in her life she spoke a pure, unvarnished truth. "Because you reminded me there's still beauty in the world," she said, her voice breaking, "and I don't want to live in a world without it." The words hung in the sterile air between them, a fragile bridge built across an impossible divide. For a long moment, Samuel just looked at her, searching her face for the trick, the angle, the hidden clause. He found nothing but a profound, aching sincerity that mirrored the sorrow in his own soul. The rigid tension in his shoulders finally gave way, and he slumped back into the chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a wave of overwhelming relief that was so immense it was almost painful. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes closing as he processed the impossible hope she had just handed him. In that silent, shared moment of vulnerability, the absurd promise made in a ballroom died, and a genuine human connection, born of compassion and desperation, quietly took its place. Lily's surgery was a quiet miracle. The news was delivered not with fanfare, but with the calm, steady assurance of a surgeon who had seen the edge and guided a child back from it. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Eleanor was a constant, unassuming presence. She didn't send assistants or lavish gifts. She brought coffee and sat for hours in the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, reading or simply watching the rhythm of the hospital unfold. She and Samuel rarely spoke of the ballroom. Instead, their conversations were built on the small, vital details of Lily's progress, the color returning to her cheeks, her first real laugh. Their friendship was forged in the sterile, antiseptic air of those corridors. A bond formed not over champagne, but over shared anxiety and the profound, humbling relief of a life saved. It was a connection far more real than any she had ever known in her world of calculated alliances. 6 months later, Eleanor unveiled the Reed Foundation. She had sold off several of her father's most prized and soulless properties to create it, liquidating a legacy of cold ambition to build one of warm opportunity. The Foundation's mission was simple and clear: to find the hidden geniuses in the world's forgotten corners, providing instruments, instruction, and scholarships to children with immense talent but limited means. Samuel, no longer a janitor, but the Foundation's artistic director, was its soul. He traveled to community centers and underfunded schools, his eyes now searching for the spark of artistry in a child's gaze. He wasn't performing on the world's grandest stages, but he had found a purpose far more meaningful, ensuring that no other musician's soul would be silenced by the crushing weight of circumstance, giving them the chance he never had. The cavernous penthouse overlooking the park was sold, its stark white walls and cold marble floors a monument to a loneliness Eleanor no longer recognized as her own. She bought a brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, a house with a small garden where Lily could play and rooms that filled with warm afternoon light. It was a home, not a statement. Samuel and Lily became her family, a small, fiercely loyal trio bound by an extraordinary circumstance. They didn't fill the void within her. They helped her dismantle the walls around it, revealing a capacity for love she never knew she possessed. Most evenings, the sound of a simple, second-hand upright piano, the very one Samuel had once dreamed of for his daughter, would drift through the house. Eleanor would listen, finally understanding that true wealth was not the power to own everything, but the profound peace of belonging somewhere. One crisp autumn afternoon, Samuel sat at that piano, his fingers moving over the keys, playing the Chopin nocturne that had changed their lives. This time, it was not a lament of sorrow, but a hymn of gratitude. Lily sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, her own small hands following his across the ivory. Eleanor watched them from an armchair, a genuine, unforced smile on her face. The crimson stain on her gown had long since faded, but the music it had unleashed had colored their world with a richness she never could have purchased. It had rewritten their futures, proving that a single act of compassion can resonate more powerfully than a lifetime of ambition. It's a privilege to witness how a life can be so completely transformed, and every time you join us by subscribing, you help us continue to share these powerful reminders of our shared humanity.